Greetings and welcome to Let's Talk About Books, baby, where we talk with your favorite LGBTQ plus authors. I'm Anita Kelly, and my guest today is Tony Keith Jr. Hello, Tony.
Hey, hey, hey. What's up? What's up? What's up? Hey, Anita.
Hey, how are you?
I am incredibly joyful is probably the best words that I can use to describe how I really am right now.
Wow, that's awesome. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
despite all the mess going on in the world, I've got joy.
All right. I am so glad to hear it because it is a mess.
It really is.
Uh,
And
so,
I physically live in Washington, D.C., so I'm just like, oh gosh.
oh, you're in the thick of it.
You can just feel it in the air. You just feel it.
Oh boy. Yeah, you need a vacation.
I do.
So Tony, let's
Yeah.
talk about your most recent release called Knucklehead.
Yeah, let's
Yeah.
talk about my second
Yeah.
baby. Yeah.
I have a question for you. What is
So,
the significance of the title?
this is great. I love this question because it takes me, it really does take me back to being a little young boy. But I come from a community where I was called a knucklehead by like loving adults in my life, like my mom, my
Oh,
grandmom, teachers sometimes. But I think that the idea of a knucklehead, at least within the spaces I grew up in, were like, yo, we were loving little boys, but we probably had a little sass. We probably had a little bit of an attitude problem. We might have been a little talkative, or maybe gotten a little bit of trouble, but we weren't bad in our core, if that makes sense. And
sure.
and I think that the term knucklehead within mainstream language is usually used to mean like something really bad. And I was like, someone who, sort of has like a bad character demeanor. And I was like, I just really want to advance that language forward and think more about young black boys, especially the gay and the queer ones, who are just lovable, misunderstood, little just knuckleheads. I
Yeah.
know so many of them. And I was like, I want to write something to them. And so that's where the title came from. But visually, if people, it might be interesting for readers to know is that Knucklehead on the cover, the E is the letter is blue, and there's like a little carrot underneath it. And that just happened to come from when I was thinking about writing this book to an audience. I was doing some workshops with a group of about 40 high school black boys in DC around hip hop and masculinity. And I said, I got this book coming out next year or the year after next, and it's going to be called Knucklehead. And I misspelled the word knucklehead on the board. I forgot the E.
Uh,
And I added it in later and put the little carrot, and they thought it was hilarious. I'm a grown man with a PhD and I can't spell, and but they think it's funny, and they say you should keep it like that. So if people see the cover, you'll see a picture of what looks like a little black boy, like in school, face backwards in the chair, and there's the knucklehead, and there's the E. That's got a little fun little message to it. So
oh, I love the cover. I love the scribbles. It's like, it's
yeah.
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it brings me a lot of joy. It reminds me of, I don't know if you've read it or other readers have, my first book, How the Boogeyman Became a Poet. I included handwritten copies of the poems I used to write as a kid. And
Oh,
shout out to my publisher and the cover artist, David Curtis. I think that they were able to take that idea of like written script and add that to this image. And that just it brought me so much joy.
oh yeah, it's wonderful.
Thank you.
So Knucklehead is a collection of poems.
Yes, Knucklehead is a young adult collection of poems. I say it's written to black men and boys, especially the gay and queer ones, and the people who love us. So if you want to love me, then you should read this book. If you already love me, then you should definitely read this book. But if you want to love other people like me, you should definitely read this book. But yeah, and it is a series of poems that I've written to myself over the last, I would say, 30 years. There's a poem in Knucklehead that I wrote when I was about 15, and another one I wrote when I was about 40. And
Mm.
they sort of chronicle what my experience has been like in just being a black gay man in America. And they're connected because there's such a time lapse. They're connected by love letters or stories that are written in verse. Letters that I wrote to that group of black boys that inspired that cover. I was like, you know what? I'm gonna write these letters to them and weave my poems in between.
It is a beautiful collection. I love the one called Dear Knucklehead.
Ah, yeah, the very first one, or I mean, because there's there. So readers should know there are five Dear Knucklehead poems, and the very first one is a poem essentially about purpose. It's a letter about purpose, or at least I use that as a metaphor. There are illustrations in this book. I really do got to shout out, if we have time, Julian Aiden Alexander, who was the illustrator for the book. And so he read the collection and created the illustrations in the book on his own. And they came out, I think, incredibly beautiful, but they look like they're sketched, like he traced, like sketched them on the page. But yeah, but that first Dear Knucklehead, there's a picture of a planet. There's a little black boy sort of spinning a planet around in the universe. And for me, a planet just represents purpose. And I'm like, yo, have you ever just really been someone who's probably been misunderstood, right? Probably who's not been heard, or who's been stereotyped or categorized in a negative way, who still believes that you got a purpose in you? Like, who just really believes that you can, like you're supposed to do something, you know? So that's sort of that very first poem.
Yeah, yeah, it's beautiful. And I was going to ask you who did these illustrations. They're absolutely fabulous.
Yeah. Julian, again, I wish I met him in person. I've never met, I follow him on Instagram. He's at Snake Bone. And that's kind of all I know. But I sent him a direct message recently, and I was like, yo, you did such a wonderful job. But I've never met this person. But he did these I mean, they're stunning. They took
Yeah.
my poetry collection beyond what I imagined visually. I had never thought that I would see something like this.
Yeah, he really captured, I think, the essence of each poem.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, reading through this, it's almost to me like you are more than a poet. You are more,
Ah,
I would say, a philosopher.
yes. Oh, that's so funny you use that word.
Yeah?
Yeah, only because here's the thing. This is the truth. I have a PhD, and so I think so much, and I'm actually working on some like reflective writing right now. That I don't know. It may be a third book. I don't know. But I've been thinking about this idea about being a philosopher, and how much I do engage in a lot of wonder, and I go to my poems for questions.
Hmm.
I've always been someone when I'm trying to figure something out. I start writing poems to try to figure it out. But yeah, I am quite the philosopher. I am the thinker.
Yeah. Yeah. You are. You are. It's amazing. You should do something with that. Like, I don't
Yeah,
know.
I'm thinking about it. I'm fascinated by right now, and this is what's really embedded in Knucklehead, at least with the images and a lot of the imagery is. I have a beautiful. My husband and I, we built this really beautiful home in Southeast Washington D.C. It's I love it here, and there's just the sky is always crystal clear. Like I can see stars and the moon. Like it's beautiful. And he bought me a telescope. And I've
Oh,
been trying to still figure out how to use the thing. But anyway, my point is, I
yes.
find myself being like, you know what? Yeah, like even right now, I'm on this my Zoom. We're on Zoom talking with one another, this platform. But
Hmm.
I'm like, but we're also on a spinning planet in space.
Hmm.
Like there's this interesting reality that I'm often thinking about,
Hmm.
and I just can't stop thinking about like, there's a reason why we're here. There's got to be a reason. And it can't be to hate or to hit
Hmm.
or to hurt. It's got to be the love. It's got to be the love or to appreciate or find belong. I'm like, there's a reason why I'm here. And
You're
so for
spreading
me,
the joy.
yeah, yeah. And that's why at the very end of Knucklehead, well, I don't want to give away too much, but there is a poem that you will read in Knucklehead that kind of talks about like how at some point I realized that my economic reality will rely on my poetic balladry. And so and I wrote that poem in 2006, and
Oh,
I am really a full-time poet right now. Like my life is built on writing and performing, and I love
yeah.
it. I'm earning an honest living off my passions and dreams. And so that's just something where I'm like, yeah, this is. I feel like we just need more narratives, more books like these, more things like these, especially Black men and boys, like
Yeah.
examples of masculinity that can look like this.
Yeah. Definitely. I couldn't agree more. Oh my goodness. Yeah. It's just a wonderful collection of poems. Like, um,
Thank you, thank
yeah. And listeners, you know, I would highly recommend go get a copy. And I don't think an e-copy. I don't even know if it's an e-copy, but
Yeah, oh,
e-format.
it's available. Yeah, if you get e-copy, you can also I also self-narrated my audiobook. I
Ooh.
self-narrated my audiobook for my first book, How the Boogeyman Became a Poet. Happy to talk to you about that.
Oh yeah.
But I narrate these books, and so you can listen to this audiobook collection. You can also so you can get it in ebook, you can get it in audio, and you can get it of course in hard copy. It'll be available in paperback next year.
All right. All right. I would recommend getting the hardback book with this beautiful cover. And then, I don't know. I like to hold books, and
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Me
this is
too. Me
one of
too.
those
Me too.
books that I think you need to hold.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Although I will say, just a quick shout out to the audiobook is my HarperCollins is they're so great with their publishing because although I just go into the studio and read my book, which is an interesting experience in and of itself, just reading, I'm like, oh, I've been writing these poems to myself forever, and here I am in the studio now reading them, and now the world is going to hear them. Woo, talk about vulnerable.
Oh my
But
goodness. Yeah.
yeah. But what happens is they add in all these elements that I sometimes just don't expect. And so there's drums and there's music and there's sounds
Oh,
like I'm tapping a microphone. And I mean, they curate. I mean, I just think of course I'm biased, but it is a really cool audiobook. My first book, How the Boogeyman Became a Poet, they did the same exact thing. It is so cool. And it actually recently won an Odyssey Award with the American Library Association. So it's one of the top audiobooks for young adults in the country right now. But they've done
awesome.
some really cool, they did a really cool thing with this audiobook. So hold the book, and yes, those of you who might want to consume it by listening, it'll be me. It's me.
That is
Sound
great. I might
like
have to do both here. Okay. So I have to ask you, who is Lil Chris, and why did
Oh,
you dedicate Knucklehead to them?
yeah, I was wondering if anyone was going to ask that question about him. So, Little Chris, that's a pseudonym for a little boy that my husband and I around this time last year when How the Boogeyman Became a Poet launched. We received, and not received, yeah, well, we received a child from the Children and Family Services Agency. So he
Yeah.
was a kid who he needed a home for a while.
Yeah.
And so he came and he lived with us for about a week. And I was just so inspired because he absolutely was such a knucklehead, right? Like with all the temper
Oh,
tantrums and the sass and and slightly aggressive, but he was so lovable and so joyful and he giggled and he had an imagination. And I just remember thinking to myself when he was rehomed back with his family, which was the ultimate goal of these kinds of service programs. I just remember thinking to myself, like, that I'm so glad I met that little knucklehead, like he really just kind of
oh.
changed my life. So yeah, so that's who little Chris is.
Does he know that you dedicated the book to him?
No, I haven't seen him since he
Okay.
was rehome. We haven't seen him since. Well, actually, I have seen him once around Thanksgiving. We was rehome with his family, but he was only 6 years old, and I
Yeah.
remember asking him if he ever knew what poetry was. He didn't know what poetry was, but we did have a wonderful moment where I think we talked about metaphors, and he used to have a lot of temper tantrums, right? And he was
Mm-hmm.
6 years old, but sometimes 2-year olds, they kick and they scream
Yep.
and they fuss. So he was kind of having moments like that, and I knew where that was coming from, and I knew that he wasn't a bad little boy, but he was trying to figure it out. And so I remember saying to him one day he was having a tantrum about something, and he's on the ground kicking and screaming, and I said, "What are you?" I said, "Are you feeling something? Are you feeling mad?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm feeling mad."
Mhm.
And I said, "Well, what does mad taste like?" And he starts licking his lips, and he says.
Oh.
He says it's nasty. I said, okay, so mad tastes nasty. He says, yeah. I said, well, what does nasty taste like? He was like, pickles. And I was like, okay, so mad tastes like pickles. He says, yeah. And so, we essentially I was trying to help him sort of understand that what he's experiencing is real. And he
Yeah.
might have words for it, but you can describe it. You can
Yes.
relate it to something else. And so when I think about this poetry collection, I'm like, I was the little boy who did not have an adult tell me I could do this, but instinctually, I'm so grateful, maybe ancestors, I knew that I could do this thing where I was feeling something I couldn't explain, but I knew that I could write it in a poem and it always made me feel better, or at
Yeah.
least made me feel like I had a hold on what was going on, right?
Yeah. That is so important for kids to have that outlet, because so often kids who, like, they have these massive feelings. They don't know where to go with them. They don't know how to
Yes,
describe them. They don't
yes,
like nobody, because adults don't readily talk about feelings. So how does a child understand
yeah,
feelings and learn about feelings?
yeah,
So that
yeah.
is great that you did that. Especially, like, it sounds like he was a little maybe developmentally delayed. Um, so it
Just
sounds
emotionally, I would say emotionally. He was
okay.
emotionally. I think I would just say, yeah. And I wouldn't even use the word delay. I think that I would say emotionally unaware. I just
Okay.
think that, I just think that he just didn't quite understand what he was feeling. I don't think he had language for his feelings. I
Yeah.
think that all he knew was, I know how to react in this particular way, I will kick and scream because it's getting me the reaction that I need from an adult so that I know that I'm cared about.
Yeah. Yeah. I
You know
love
what I mean?
that. Yeah.
I think that that's what it was. I think that that was sort of like to get an adult to care about me, I got to kick and scream.
Yeah.
And what hopefully he learned while he was with me and my husband for that 1 week was that, like you're lovable anyway. You
Yeah.
don't need to do all this. We see you. We recognize what's going on. You're feeling something. You have feelings. It's okay to be a black boy having feelings.
Yeah.
Like I'm an adult black man. I get mad. There are poems in Knucklehead about when I get mad. It's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
You're a human being. You are
Yeah.
not bad for that. And so for me, that's what I really wanted, little Chris to understand, and even readers of Knucklehead to understand is, especially when we're thinking about little black boys, especially black boys, thinking specifically about the narratives that we tell ourselves about them. And if we go in there believing that they're already bad, there are poems in Knucklehead I write about me teaching poetry inside of jails and prisons to
Yeah.
black men and boys.
Yeah.
Right? Thinking
Yep.
about what masculinity looks like in that space. I'm like, yo, again, I don't want to be, I want to be clear what I'm saying. I'm not defending anyone in their cases. I'm just
Sure.
thinking about in spaces where there are human beings who are trying to understand themselves and whatever I'm like, yo, I understand. I see you, human,
Mm-hmm.
in this. I see you.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yep.
know.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that not all, but many folks who are involved in the criminal justice system
Yeah.
are have come from misunderstood childhoods.
Yep. Yep.
Childhoods where they really weren't nurtured, fostered.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that and also, a system, a law enforcement system that targets
Yeah.
them because of the way that they might look or
Yeah.
speak or,
Yep.
make assumptions about them. And I write about this in Knucklehead about, about whether people might question the presence of their bodies in public and, what people might just naturally be thinking about them based on the way they look. I think so much about like how I remember visiting, Chris when he was the little Chris, the little, boy that I
Mm-hmm.
talk about in Knucklehead, inside of his school, and he was the kid in his teacher's classroom that had the desk all the way in the back, right? Who
Oh,
was, off to the side. And I'm thinking to myself, like, gosh, like I understand in this moment, this teacher needs to absolutely manage this classroom. And this little boy is probably wildly disruptive. And I'm like, he's also a little human being who still deserves attention and love and care. And he needs to know that
yeah.
both of these, like need to exist sort of at the same time. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I just, yeah,
He should have been front and center.
yeah. Okay. If anything, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep.
And
Yep.
yeah, like they're just kind of those kinds of moments. And so that's really what this collection is about because I withheld so much as a child dealing with, and I write about this in my very first book, How the Boogeyman Became a Poet. The boogeyman essentially is a metaphor for internalized racism, internalized homophobia. And because I grew up relatively poor, sort of this idea that I would never go to college and amount to much. And so, I think so much about the narratives that I was even hearing about myself in the 80s and 90s as a little black boy, let alone a closeted gay little black boy, just how much I needed to hear, how much it would have been helpful to hear positive things about me. And I did
Yep.
hear them. I mean, I think that's
Yep.
what, if anything, Knucklehead is also about is there's this duality. I think that sometimes, those of us who are knuckleheads really hear is that in one ear, we are lovable as I don't know what our mama loves us.
Yeah.
Some of our teachers might love us, our neighbors down the street. Oh, but, this policy that just came down from a particular administration is telling me that I'm not lovable,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Or this news article that I just read about people who live in this particular country where being gay is considered legal is telling me that I'm not lovable. So there's this, experiencing ourselves in these two worlds.
Yeah. 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 It's such a dichotomy, and
Yeah.
kids need a place to go with all that.
Yes, yes. Go to the poems. Go to the poems. And probably the last thing, I don't want to eat up too much time, but one thing I'll also say is the poems that the process of writing poetry is, I think I mentioned is something that I processed as a little kid. It was my way of dealing with it. But the poems that are printed inside of How the Boogeyman Became a Poet are handwritten copies of the poems I used to write to myself as a kid. And I only included them in that book is because I was going through a crisis, a mental crisis around 2019. I was laid off from my full-time job while writing my dissertation, and I was 1 year married with my husband, and then the COVID-19 hit the next year, and I'm just trying to figure out how we're going to make ends meet, and all I can think about is the poems, and I'm in therapy. I have a black male therapist, and he's telling me, like, Tony, you need to look at the poems you've been writing yourself. Look at the poems you've been carrying around with you since you were a little kid that I write about a boogeyman became a poet. And then I wound up reading those poems. It was about 100 of them, and it was took me about 3 days. And I cried and I laughed, and one of them I set on fire. But it became this. I realized, like, yo, this is how I've been able to sort of manage my emotions, how I've constructed my masculinity. This method. This is a method,
Yeah.
that I've been
Yeah.
using to just,
Yeah.
yeah, restrain and,
Yeah. Manage.
you know, manage. Yes, 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 yes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's beautiful, man. Um,
Thank you. Thank you.
yeah. So, Boogie, what is it? How the Boogeyman
How
Became
the
a
Boogeyman
Poet.
became a
Yeah. So that
yeah.
was your first published work, right?
Yeah, that's my first published work. That one is a young adult. Both of these books are, by the way, are written for young adult audiences, but that also means that lots of adults should
Yeah.
read them.
Yep.
I,
Definitely.
I'm an adult. I'm an adult who only reads YA books. Well, not only, but like 90% of what I read are YA books. So anyway,
Yeah.
but yeah, How the Boogeyman Became a Poet is a young adult memoir, and the memoir is all written in verse, meaning each page is sort of structured like poems, and it tells the story of three things: how did I, one, become the first person in my family to go to college? Two, how did I start coming out the closet as gay? And three, how I discovered, as I've been talking to you about, poetry is sort of as this jam, my jam, this freedom, this thing that I do.
Hmm.
And the story begins in spring 1999, and I'm in my senior year of high school, and I'm about to graduate. And I don't know what I'm going to do because no one's ever gone to college in my family. I don't know what I'm doing. And I have a girlfriend, but I'm pretty sure I got crushes on boys. And I'm secretly writing poems to myself that nobody can see. And so you sort of figure out how within a 2 year time span did I find a way to get into college, and how I found a way to come out the closet, and how I really learned what the poems and what they do for me, what they're really about.
It's like you had this whole internal world going on that nobody knew about.
Yes. Yes.
That's
And I
right.
think so many of us have this, especially young people who I think don't have language to really like to say what's going on in their world. How the boogeyman became a poet, I think I might have mentioned before, but I'll reiterate that, it became a metaphor for these complex topics that I couldn't talk about as like a 10-year-old or 11-year-old. I didn't have words like racism and
Yeah.
homophobia and like questioning. Like
Yeah.
I just didn't have that language. It didn't, none of it made
You
sense,
had the
and also,
feelings, but nothing to go with it.
yeah, but nothing to go with it. And I also did not have any examples of openly gay
Yeah.
black men
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah.
I didn't know, like, no one. And so I'm trying to navigate this within a world that's like, well, everybody's straight. So,
Yeah.
like
Yep.
your default.
Yep. Yep.
Also write about growing up in the black church and how that also, reinforced quite a lot
Oh
of
yeah.
beliefs that I had about myself and my developing, questioning black gay identity. But I'm
Yeah.
like, yeah, I think that all of us have this internal voice in our minds that are like, within a healthy context around like, yo, what is going on?
Yeah. 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 For real. It's and I think that kids who are straight and seemingly have a path, I think they too have like this internal thing going on that
Yes.
they don't talk about. I think it's just like it's that angst of adolescence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. There's because there's I don't know, I probably would, because I'm a philosopher, I would
Mm.
probably make, the argument that there's a bit of a fear about like, well, what if I do say something? I think so much about how even for Knucklehead, some of the poems I wrote about, so I don't know if I mentioned this on this interview or might have been before, but I was doing some workshops with a group of young black men in a youth juvenile facility in Washington, D.C. And, I'm not quite sure what they were in there for. It wasn't my point, but I was there to teach them poetry and talk about hip hop culture and yada, yada, yada. And, one of them noticed that I was wearing a wedding ring, I'm assuming, because he says, "Hey, Tony, how does your wife feel about the fact that you are, a full-time poet, a full-time artist, and you're a writer? Like, how does your wife feel about that? And I remember thinking to myself, like, oh my God, like I gotta come out.
Yeah.
And I'm always coming out. I'm almost 44 years old and I am still coming out.
Yeah.
And so it's
Yep.
it's like never stops. And I'm thinking to myself, like the politics around masculinity within this particular space,
Yes.
because it's dangerous to be out in that. It's physically and
Yes.
all sorts of, and I'm like, but I also know that if I don't, I need to know, I know that I'm not the only gay one in here.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
so for me, it was a matter of like, all right, the poetry taught me how to be brave and I'm gonna speak my truth. And I said, well, I'm gonna just be honest with y'all, fellas. I'm gay and my husband loves the fact that this is what I do for a living and it's great. And there was like a 3-second pause, which is a long time in a place like that because you
Yeah.
don't know what's going to come down. And one of the fellas got up and he started slow clapping. And
Oh.
it's like, yo, that's what I'm talking about. It's a lot of men won't be willing to say something like that. And he then encouraged everybody else in there, and this like we were like in a pod, right?
Uh,
Everybody in that pod to stand up and start clapping. I wound up getting a standing ovation for coming out in
oh.
like a jail setting through poetry. And in my
Oh.
head, I'm like, this is healthy masculinity,
Yes. Yes. Definitely. Most
right?
definitely. Yep. Yeah. You showed them. You showed them how
Yeah.
it's done.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and for the gay ones who were in there who had to be closeted,
Yeah.
and who knows, I'm sure they probably did whatever they had to do to keep themselves safe. If
Yeah.
anything, they knew at that moment that they were not alone.
Yeah. Definitely.
Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yep. It's like I see you in here, and I'll be
Mm-hmm.
brave enough to speak on behalf of all of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
That's
know?
that's wonderful. That is wonderful.
Thank
So,
you.
Tony, I want to ask you. You're an EDMC. So,
Ed MC, short for educational
ah.
MC. Yeah, it's based on my findings from my dissertation research. I studied individuals who are relatively like me, who embody hip hop culture. And we could probably talk about that at their time. I don't know if you want to. The philosophy of hip hop, the
Mm-hmm.
belief that the more you know about who you are and where you come from, the more powerful you can show up in the world. And for some people, that could be a rapper or a DJ or or a break dancer. I'm an MC. I say I'm someone who can move crowds with a microphone. Some people know master of ceremonies.
Uh-huh.
I say in education, ed MCs or educational MCs are people who know how to master conditions or demonstrate a mastery of conditions for learning and engagement, especially for marginalized students.
Uh,
So poets, spoken word artists, rappers, and MCs who do work in education. I'm an ed MC, and that's what the findings from my dissertation taught me.
oh, that's so cool. That's so cool. So
Yeah.
you also do like you're a spoken word artist, right?
Yep. I'm a
Um
spoken word artist. I'm a poet. Yep.
so do you experience like a difference in I want to say the reception of and even the perception of like your spoken word work versus your written work like from
Yeah,
an
this
audience?
is a really great question because I published How the Boogeyman Became a Poet last year, and then Knucklehead just came out this year. And so I would say, like, over the last year, what I'm experiencing is something really interesting, and it has a lot to do with because I'm a philosopher, I would call the call and response. So when I perform spoken word poetry, it's usually live,
Mm-hmm.
and there's an audience. And what usually happens for me is I can like, say a line of a poem and then audience might respond with like a or a snap or like there's some sort of response. It's almost like in a black church as a call and response. And so there's this thing that happens in live that I love. I feed on it. It gives me good energy and I just kind of like attack the microphone. Well, when it came down to putting poetry on the page and even verse on the page, like with Boogeyman, my editor told me, he was like, Tony, just like you perform on the stage, you can perform on the page. Just think about your page sort of as your microphone. Well, he probably didn't say that. That was the poet in me that made it a metaphor. But
Mm-hmm.
thinking about the page sort of as like how I can just make the words move and perform on the page. And so what's happening is the call and response I can't hear it because I can't hear every reader, right? You know what I mean? Like I can't, that's the unfortunate part is readers just take the book and they go, and I just hope they love it. But what does happen though is there's a response that I get when I like that I've been hearing lately, at least about Knucklehead, where people, like even my mom called me yesterday. She's like, baby, I'm reading Knucklehead and I got to one of these poems. I've heard you perform this poem before and it made me want to say it out loud. And I had to be quiet. And she's whispering because she's like in an office environment. And someone else said the same thing. I've been hearing lately that Knucklehead, for some people, it's sort of causing them to almost like want to say some of the poems out loud. And a part of me is like, I think that I've discovered, the thing, that connects
Hmm.
the spoken word and the written word. And it's got to be somehow the structure of the language or in the rhyme or something. But I know it has to do with musicality. Because I think about, I was a little black boy who used to read books, poems by Langston Hughes and
Right.
Countee Cullen, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Nikki Giovanni. So a lot of black poets who wrote with rhythm and rhyme. And I think that I just sort of adapted that. And I think that that's the thing that I'm learning kind of bridges the gap between my written word and my spoken word. It's realizing who my audience is and what the call and response might look like.
Oh, that's so cool. That is so cool. Yeah.
Hopefully
Yeah.
that made sense.
Yeah, it did.
I'm
And I love
a
that your editor like kind of opened that door for you and said, "Hey, you can do
Yeah,
this."
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm really, really grateful. I will definitely give Ben Rosenthal like his roses. I really, really, really appreciate him as my editor. He's no longer with HarperCollins, and I had him for those two books. Who knows? There might be a third one on the way. Fingers crossed. We'll see. But no, Ben Rosenthal was fantastic as an editor. Like he really understood who I was as a writer, the voice that I wanted to make sure showed up on the page, and he really gave me a lot of freedom and free reign to play and do what I needed to do. But he also, held me, accountable to like, good standards within publishing and making sure that there's a good storyline and that it threads through well. And also shout out to Rosemary Bronson, who sort of took over as my editor once Ben went on to other things beyond HarperCollins. So, and Rosemary helped publish this thing right on through. And she called it a magnificent collection. And so I'm just grateful to have editors who really get me as a
Yeah.
writer, as a poet, in the way that I want to show up.
Yeah, that's so important. So,
Yeah,
have you
it is.
always have you always wanted to write? Like in
No, I promise you, you know what, Anita, I promise you, I didn't see this. I did not see this for myself. It's so funny
what?
because one of the last poems in Knucklehead says, "Dear Knucklehead, I was a poet afraid to publish."
Ah,
Right? Like I talk so much about like how I only saw myself as a performance poet. That's the truth. I didn't think about publishing books. I
okay.
was not a kid who I just didn't I didn't see that for myself. It wasn't until let's see, if there, yeah, there's time for the story. So that time
Yeah.
period when I mentioned I was going through therapy around 2019, 2020, I'm at the University of South Carolina in Columbia, South Carolina, and I'm doing a series of workshops and talks with a group of students in middle and high school with my friend and fellow author Jason Reynolds. He's Oh my gosh, young adult ambassador for literature. Jason is amazing. Anyway, if you never read anybody's books, everybody read Jason Reynolds. And Jay's wildly famous for all the books he's published. Anyway, and I've known him forever. And so anyway, so we're after every event, there's always a book signing for Jason. And what happens is, I'm sitting at a table with him for his book signing, and I'm just like on my phone, I'm chilling, and he's signing books. And there's this little black boy that gets out of line with a black woman, and they walk right up to me, and he says, "Hey, Mr. Tony, where's your book?" Not, do you have a book, but
Yeah.
like the book that you have, where is it? Like, where's the book? And I'm looking at him like, and I stumble, because I just finished this PhD and I'm like, I've got academic papers and, I published on the stage. I say some really corny mess to this little boy. And he looks at me and he's like, okay. And I think if I remember this correctly, the woman might have said, well, let us know when you write your book.
Oh.
And walk away, they walk away and I go back to my hotel room that night and I think to myself, what book are they talking about? And it hit me. I was like, well, maybe this little boy is trying to figure something out about himself. And maybe this woman knows that he's trying to figure it out too. So where's the book for him? Where's the book for her? And then it was like, boing, Tony, where's the book that you needed?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so like that was the moment. And then because Jason Reynolds, he writes in the young adult space.
Hmm.
And he was the first writer whose work I really started reading where I was like, oh, this makes sense to me because he writes really cool. And it sounds like, oh, this sounds like a black dude talking. This is great. And the
Hmm.
stories are relevant. Oh, and I'm doing air tags, culturally relevant literature that I'm consuming.
Uh-huh.
And once I started realizing that this was a thing, I was like, maybe I can write young adult literature. And so to end the story is I come back from that talk and COVID-19 hits and it's a tough time to be an artist and an educator at that moment. And I was like, I'm just going to write this book. And I wrote what I thought would have been a young adult version of my dissertation. I thought maybe the book this little boy needed
Yeah.
was how I got my PhD. And what wound up happening was my literary agent, who I got later at the time, Annie Huang, was like, Tony, the book that you are trying to write is this memoir in verse about you becoming this little gay black boy who found freedom in your poems,
Yeah.
right? And everything that you seem to be writing about is how you, as a gay black man in America, continue to find freedom in your poems. That is the thing you're writing about.
Yeah.
I was like, oh,
That's
so
awesome.
no, so I didn't see myself as a writer until what, 4 years ago?
Yeah. Yes. So many good
5 years.
things came out of the pandemic, and this is one of
Yes.
them, right?
Yes, it did. It did. It really, really did. I think that the universe, gives a lot of people windows of opportunities to do things or see things differently. And I even think about right now, so much of
Yeah.
at least my professional work as an Ed MC running Ed MC Academy is that we were doing a lot of work. Our contracts were with schools and colleges and universities and libraries and museums that were focused on belonging and inclusion and equity and all those words that are now being tossed around in the media in such negative ways. And
Yeah.
so I've seen contracts disappear
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
And all I keep thinking to myself is like, okay, this is just another moment in the universe where where
Yep.
you're gonna have to either pivot but this ain't new territory. You've been battling this since you were a little kid.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
got poems in there about how poetry is
Yeah.
always been the thing to get you through.
Yeah.
And so I look at this moment this way too, and I'm like, so I'm glad Knucklehead, a book of poems by a gay black man, is being published right now during
Yeah.
this time with all
Yeah.
this crazy going on in the world.
Yeah. Me
This
too.
came out too.
Me too.
This came out too.
Yep. Yep. It was very, very timely, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely. So, do you have any work in progress right now?
That is a really great question, and the reason why I'm over here like I'm blushing, but you can't see it because I'm really really thinking about it. This is the absolute truth. There are moments when books. I think just like the little black boy that called that book out of me,
Yeah.
the first book, just like Knucklehead was probably the little black boy in me that called that book out. What's been happening right now is there have been readers who've been asking for like another book. They're like, Tony, Mr. Tony, are you going to write something else? I really want to learn more about like, I want to be inspired. I want to feel like I like there's belonging somewhere. And so I've got an idea for maybe a novel in verse. I think I might dip my toes into fiction.
Cool.
I'm a black gay man who's traveled the continent of Africa quite a bit. And I've been thinking so much about how I've navigated my race and my sexuality in spaces where I've sort of heard the mainstream narrative is that like it is dangerous to be openly gay there.
Yeah.
And what that experience has been like for me and how I've navigated that. So I've been thinking about something about that, but turning it into like a fictional, I don't know. I've been thinking about
Yeah.
that. Or the other thing is I've been thinking also about something, because how the Boogeyman Become a Poet ends before I graduate college. And what a lot of readers of my work probably don't know is that I barely graduated college. I barely made it out. I was the first in my family to go and barely made it out, but I did. And by the time I made it out, I also had a boyfriend at the time and all kind of other stuff. And so I've been thinking about writing maybe a follow-up to Boogeyman. So maybe there are two things that are coming. Maybe there's a third, a poetry collection. But my point is, I need you to know and the universe to know I'm thinking.
Okay. All right.
I'm
We'll be waiting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've got some words down on the page, so we shall see. But I'm feeling very much moved to write something else.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's wonderful. That's awesome.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Tony, where can our listeners get a copy of Knucklehead?
Yeah, this is great. So right now you can get a copy of Knucklehead anywhere books are sold. I will also always shout out the lovely, wonderful, independent and local bookstores that might be near you that might also could use some of your love. But you can get it on online retailers. You can get it in audio book format. You can get it in digital format, and you can get it in hard copy. Paperback will be out next year. And How the Boogeyman Become a Poet is out in all the formats anywhere books are sold. You can also find it in a lot of local libraries.
Awesome. Awesome. So, Tony, do you
Yep.
have any parting words for our listeners today?
My only parting words I probably would be I think about how I think we might have started this conversation, but just be mindful that we all have a planet, rotating in our belly there. We all have some purpose. We've got some reason that we're here spinning on this rock floating in space, and let's just be mindful about what that purpose is, despite all the chaos and negativity we might hear about ourselves going on in the world,
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. That is awesome. Uh,
All right.
and the truth, right?
Word.
Yeah, definitely. And spread the joy.
That's right. Lots of joy, more joy. Consume as much joy as you possibly can. I tell young people sometimes it's okay to adjust your algorithms on your phone. I look at my iPhone and, I log into maybe like Instagram and I look at my pages and all I see are pictures of like cute black kids and families smiling. I'm listening to music, good music all
Yeah,
day, which is a privilege, I understand. But I'm like, yo, make sure you find time to consume joy also, because that helps you produce joy. I believe what we consume is also what we can produce.
absolutely. Definitely. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah.
definitely. So, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. And
Right. Well, I
yeah,
had a great time. Thanks for letting me just kind of get all that out.
no, thank you so much, Tony Keith Jr. You are awesome, and I look forward to seeing what you next have out on the market.
All right. All
Yep.
right. I'll be thinking about it. Trust me, I am thinking about
All
it.
right. All right. We'll hold you to that.
All right, cool. Thank
So,
you so much, Anita. You take
yeah,
care.
yeah, you too. That's all the time we have for today. So I'm Anita Kelly, and thanks for joining. Let's talk about books, baby. So until next time, may your journey be lighthearted, peace be plenty, and be safe, folks.